Greetings, I'm Kyle Pierce. What if I told you that the way that you define the world around you, your place within it, those things which you generally hold to be true, were really just something you or someone else made up? If you knew that the ideas and emotional responses which constitute your conception of right and wrong, true and false, of real and unreal could be dissolved and rebuilt into any number of infinite shapes, how would you utilize that information? How might someone else use it on you? In astrology, Saturn represents the laws by which all who dwell within this particular plane of existence are inextricably bound. The laws of physics, of cause and effect, of entropy. Saturn acquaints us with cold hard reality, as well as those diabolically crafted facades behind which it often hides. As Saturn enters the tropical sign of Pisces on March 8th, 2023, Saturn reveals to us the surprisingly plastic nature of reality, one woven together with streams of subjective experience, a structure built of both dreams and nightmares. If you have Saturn in Pisces, know someone with Saturn in Pisces, or just want to learn about what Saturn in Pisces means in a birth chart, or how it might manifest as a transit, stick around. So, one of my favorite ways to get started thinking about Saturn in Pisces is by thinking about what Saturn in Pisces isn't. And what Saturn in Pisces is not is in Capricorn or Aquarius anymore. Saturn in Pisces comes after a long reign of Saturn in its home signs. It shows up after a period where Saturn has been super powerful for like a really long time, like a good 5 years or more. By which time, we've had our fill of reality for a while. We spent a good long while sort of beating our heads against those limits and restrictions which Saturn often represents. And we're often looking for a way out, a way around and outside of those boundaries, those limitations, or those stuck old ways of seeing reality that, get us bound in patterns or constructs or living circumstances that we don't like so much. And to a large degree, Saturn's already doing that in Aquarius, but it's doing so on like an intellectual level. It's doing so through the realm of ideas. It's taking stock and inventory of what constitutes reality as it stands now and envisioning different ways of putting that together. Or more often, just identifying all the ways that it sucks. And Saturn deals with that material quite well. It knows what to do with thoughts and ideas. It meshes well with that sort of cool, detached, cerebral way of approaching things, of assessing what is. When Saturn gets into Pisces, however, it's dealing with water. It's dealing with feelings, emotions, which, as many of us know, is a level of experience that is not always easy to define in a hard and clear and accurate way. That's why we turn to alternatives to convey those kinds of experiences, or that level of experience. While it's relatively easy to write a book about our thoughts, about our ideas and philosophies, and construct like little isms out of them, it's pretty hard to convey in a clean and accurate way the way we experience a sunset. Even a poet, a very good one, will often do a good job using words to convey a deeper sense of feeling, of experience. But if you're reading a poem from a literal perspective, if you were a computer reading a poem and taking what's written in it, at face value as literal, it wouldn't make very much sense at all, right? So we know that the material that Saturn is working with in Pisces is not the kind of thing that just sort of comes naturally to Saturn or to Saturnine consciousness. Saturn as a pure archetype literally gives no fucks at all about how you feel or what your experience of a sunset is. It's much more concerned with the fact that now that the sun is down, bears are going to come out and potentially maul you to death. But, what that means as a starting point is that Saturn, does not have all cylinders operating in unison towards fueling an archetypally pure expression of Saturn, which is often expressed in astrology through this idea of strength, planetary strength. I'm sure you've heard that a planet is strong when it's in one of its own signs. And strong isn't always a bad word, because strong denotes the ability to exert force, exert influence. In this case, according to its natural significations, right? So Saturn, when it's in Capricorn, and when it's in Aquarius, has great capacity to impose and create very solid and eventually at least clear limits and boundaries, which can be, a good and a bad thing. But it doesn't quite tell you the full story, obviously. While Saturn experiences a significant drop-off of strength in the sense that its ability to create hard and clearly defined boundaries, to define reality by clear and hard terms, is diminished substantially, right? It also does all these other interesting things. Like if you were to build a rocket ship, right, that was streamlined to make you travel through space as quickly and efficiently as possible. It's the most spaceshipy spaceship ever built. You would look at it and say, wow, that is a magnificent monument to spacecraft engineering. It's going to do what spaceships do so awesome, but maybe you bring a new designer in and they want to add TVs to the spaceship inside. Maybe they want to add a hydroponics unit in a library. They want to make it also do something else. Make it also, a place you can live. Make it a place where you can keep your comic book collection, whatever. You may have to divert energy towards powering the TVs. You may have to add modules which further divert power and reduce the efficiency of the crew. Maybe it becomes a less efficient and fast and powerful spaceship with all these non-spaceshipy additions. But you also now have a spaceship that does a lot of other cool stuff. So that's basically a roundabout way of saying that while we definitely want to note the reduction in strength that any planet has when it's not in one of its own signs, and acknowledge it as relevant, you don't want to ignore all the other things that they do, because sometimes they produce effects which are of their own intrinsic value. Obviously, suffice it to say that while planets are strong in their home, they have a role to play in all the signs, because they spend time in all the signs. They're all archetypally relevant in some way. So, to bring it back to Saturn and Pisces, Saturn in Pisces plays an interesting role and describes a very unique part of the cycle of the building up and breaking down of structures and limitations. As, if you just think about the sign of Pisces for a moment, consider how each of the 4 seasons is represented by 3 signs. We can divide the 12 signs into 4 quadrants with 3 signs each with a modality. So for spring, in the northern hemisphere anyway, Aries, cardinal sign, initiates spring. Taurus characterizes a sort of steady, consistent part of the season where it's spring. It's about as spring can be. While Gemini deals with that transition between spring and summer, sort of in between phase, and so on with all 4 seasons. And when you get to winter, you get Capricorn, a cardinal sign, playing the role of initiating winter, signaling the time of long, cold nights where days on the beach and sipping lemonade in a hammock are about as far away and irrelevant as they can be, at least in the northern hemisphere, of course. While Aquarius carries us into that deep winter period where it's been winter for so long, the ground is frozen, snow is piled up, and it's become sort of routine. you're dealing with the winter. And while you may or may not like it, it sort of is what it is, and all we can do is do the things that we can do during winter. Um, and, imagine those things which we might be able to do when winter is past. So you already have a season that's dominated by Saturn ruled signs. But Pisces ends up playing this interesting role as the sort of lone sign sort of challenging the monopoly that Saturn has in this quadrant, in this season. And of course, it represents the time where, at least in the archetypal idea of seasons and what winter should be, not that I know many places that actually have that, Pisces season is when you start to get a bit of a mix. You start to see traces of the spring that will soon be. You get a mix of warm days and a mix of cold days, and so on and so forth. And when I think of Pisces, I like to think of the first day that you can step outside in a t-shirt after a long winter, where the snow has started to melt or has melted. And while you know that it's probably going to freeze again, you can smell like life returning. There's a special smell that day has. And in some ways, that day sort of makes winter worth it. It redeems winter. That day is made all the more special because it comes after so much cold, dreary, snowy bullshit. That tells you a little bit about Saturn's role, or Pisces' role, not just in the zodiac as a whole, but within that quadrant of time, in that quarter of the year. It is in many ways to redeem the earth once more, to begin to celebrate and anticipate the reemergence of life. But it's also where we can come to understand the role winter plays in our lives, where we can kind of integrate that season into our experience as something that is acceptable, something that is part of the greater whole. Pisces, as a Jupiter-ruled sign, generally has that sort of cleaning up and purifying role. Sort of wants to dissolve, smooth over, and unify what is difficult with what is already beautiful. Make it part of the whole so that we can, accept it, right? So that we can find meaning in all things and, heal. So when Saturn gets into Pisces, it's rather like Saturn is trying to reintegrate the sort of harsh, cold, necessity-based constructs that were formed during Saturn's time in Capricorn and Aquarius with that more felt experiential level of reality. We spend a lot of time with the hard, immutable truths, or the hard truths which take at least a Saturn cycle worth of labor to begin to change and overcome. And now we're trying to bring the hard concretization that Saturn wants to do, that Saturn does, to, the squishy part of reality, the felt emotional part. Now, one of the things that Saturn really likes to do is stress test things. It will often stress test the topics associated with the sign that it's in, and also stress test with the topics and qualities of the sign that it's in. When Saturn's in Capricorn, it can stress test hard structures like this desk, buildings, things with a physical shape. And those structures will, either stand or fall, depending on how well built they are. Aquarius, Saturn will stress test social and ideological concepts, social structures, the ideas which form the basis of social organization. And it will do so with pretty obvious and clear results. Either things fall apart, or they have to be reformed, or they have to be just thrown out altogether. Now with Saturn in Pisces, how might Saturn stress test the way that we perceive and make meaning out of our lived experience? How might Saturn stress test the boundary between the world we can see and feel and taste and touch and the one we can't, the invisible, the spiritual? Well, one of the ways that you can say that Saturn in Pisces had at least a heavy hand in was through a little drug known as LSD. While LSD was first synthesized by Albert Hofmann in 1938, while Saturn was in Aries, which is interesting on its own, but its inventor, or you could say discoverer, Albert Hofmann, was a Saturn and Pisces native. Actually had it in his 10th house. And when Albert Hofmann began testing the substance he synthesized, LSD, he described in vivid detail sort of a dissolution of the boundary between the real and the imagined, waking and dream states. He, quite by accident, created a substance that had the ability to, as some have described, sort of dissolve a certain filter that our brains create in order to engage with reality in a certain way that tends to be, useful and effective for most everyday purposes. LSD is great for a lot of things, but the state that it induces is not particularly conducive to most of the day-to-day activities which life demands. Nonetheless, exposed for a lot of people into an entirely new way of understanding or engaging with reality. You could say, in a sense, introducing a substance which tested and broke what for most people was understood to be the limit of perception of how we can experience reality, and revealed, that to be a rather flimsy thing in a lot of ways. It ended up revealing a capacity for, much more profound of engaging with life and with spiritual concepts and even social constructs. In subsequent years, a lot of people got really enthusiastic about its potential for therapeutic use in psychotherapy, and was used quite effectively in psychotherapy to help people shift their perception in ways which they previously could not, and reframe, sort of dissolve ideas and beliefs which form the underpinning of mental illness, trauma, psychological disorders of various kinds. The United States government got really excited about its capacity to be weaponized in all sorts of various ways, including mind control. And exploring that potential was the purpose of a top secret CIA project which saw the non-consensual dosing of American citizens illegally with LSD. The use of LSD also played a huge contributing role in a lot of the ideas and beliefs which formed the underpinnings of the counterculture movement in the 1960s. You actually see the first, what we would probably be able to easily recognize as hippies, while Saturn was in Pisces from the end of 1964 to early 1967. Actually, in many ways, the hippies embody and personify a lot of the essence of Saturn and Pisces, especially those attempted to take a lot of the ideas prominent in the counterculture movement. Free love, peace, basically being against anything that would be identifiable as a construct of mainstream culture, which served to divide people into socially stratified hierarchies. In fact, the lack of cohesion, within that movement, could, be seen as a element of Saturn and Pisces. But basically, anybody who took those ideas and tried to concretize them in a hard, definable philosophy, as many did. Some took it to rather severe extremes in certain cases. But you saw a lot of sort of experimental communities forming out of people who wanted to dissolve those boundaries that existed between people and live more communal and less structured lifestyles within those communities. Many of those communes didn't last particularly long or work out all that well. Nonetheless, many great ideas and cultural movements were born of that period and carry through to this day. But you can actually see really strong parallel between hippie culture and another product of Saturn and Pisces, an earlier one perhaps, which is the Romantic movement. Now, Romanticism, yeah, Romanticism as an artistic, an intellectual movement, it's really hard to pin down a specific origin point for it, obviously, as most such movements often are. However, you will see the signature of Saturn and Pisces in many of its prominent authors, especially the early ones, and a lot of the seminal works of Romantic literature between 1788 and 1790, when Saturn was in Pisces. And some of the primary characteristics that define the Romantic movement are an emphasis on emotion, conveying or expressing of powerful feelings, and a sort of primacy of the individual to define and express their experience of life and reality. Romantic art and literature was very much a rejection of what were perceived to be overly rigid and stuffy definitions of what constituted good or legitimate art. It was moving away from sort of technical definitions of quality art and adherence to convention, as well as a rejection of the influence of a lot of Enlightenment period ideas that were pervasive in art and literature during the 18th century, which kind of was fetishized or like glorified a sort of a revival of the classical world of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Romantics didn't like that. They tended to glorify like the medieval period more. There's also a huge emphasis on nature, returning to nature, appreciating and finding beauty in nature, and moving away from a lot of the ideas of progress that industrialization represented, and this kind of emphasis on just imagination rather than scientific reasoning. A lot like the hippies, there's a rejection of what was perceived to be a sort of artificial construction of boundaries and definitions around not just what good art was, but like what meaningful existence was. For Romantics, meaningful existence wasn't about being rational or achieving things according to conventional social standards, achieving high rank or high station or wealth or, inventing cool machines and shit. It was about connecting to a more natural and deeply felt mode of experiencing life, to live life richly, deeply, and passionately. And there's a weird sort of irony with the Romantic movement and, say the hippie movement too, but keeping it focused on the Romantic movement. So there's, like I said, this primacy of the individual imagination and way of constructing, experiencing life and reality, while rejecting kind of objective notions of how we should, experience things, objective mainstream ideas of that. Sort of return to natural law, natural conceptions of what's good art, right? That are based on, how something makes you feel. But the thing is that Saturn, whenever Saturn gets its hands in things, like Saturn likes isms a lot. Saturn likes to create structures, define things in terms of what's inside versus what's outside. There's always an exclusionary element to what Saturn does and to isms, right? Isms are the systematization of ideas, a system of thought, a set of prerequisites that something must meet in order to fall under the category of whatever ism. But once you start defining things in that way, in some ways you move away from what something like the Romantic movement was trying to do, which was trying to elevate authentic personal expression, while in some ways still sort of defining a structure of what they thought that authentic personal expression was. Not to beat up on Romantics or anything. But, hippies in many ways ran into the same issue on both ends. The sort of unwillingness to create rules and define things, to leave things in an ambiguous state, created a lot of problems or a lot of issues. The inability to organize socially and create the kind of structures that organize human behavior and regulate relationships between people resulted in a lot of chaos and weirdness and interesting, sometimes bizarre, and in some cases tragic, mini social experiments within communes. But you also get a sort of interesting way in which, some people who we might call hippies, built a Saturn wall around that ambiguous space, up around the right to have it, which certainly I'm sure certain communes operated and continued to operate in total peace and love and harmony. But I imagine a lot of it that depended on maintaining a certain amount of distance or limiting the interaction with, outside mainstream society. It's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's one of the things I think is kind of cool about Saturn and Pisces is there's sort of a commitment and value system, in some cases built around the sort of just being chill and cool with everybody and sort of, everybody's on their own trip, right? And that is, I think, one of the truths that Saturn and Pisces reveals is that, it is fundamentally true and incontrovertible that everybody perceives and experiences reality in a way that's, totally unique to themselves. And ideally, as long as one person's version of reality isn't actively harming another person's, then, sort of being chill with everybody else's version of reality being what it is an ideal place to be. Maybe one worth building a wall around and protecting. But then there's ways that you can get the dark side of that quality of Saturn and Pisces. There's a lot of potential for the capacity for an individual to sort of weave a reality out of whole cloth from their own experience, even, manipulate and mold it. It's being, potentially dangerous, as, with all things, that there's always a way to do it in a way that's going to be problematic, right? But maybe a good example of the dark side of Saturn and Pisces can be found with Joseph Stalin, who was the premier of the USSR from mid-1920s-ish to early 1930s, most notably during, before and after, and the years surrounding World War II. Joseph Stalin is a Saturn and Pisces native, and while there's no definitive birth time for him, some of the charts that I've seen, or one version of his chart, rather, that is quite convincing, though obviously we can't hang our hat on it. But one version has Joseph Stalin with Pisces rising with Saturn on his ascendant. It's in a super tight trine with Mars and Scorpio, and Mars is opposed by Pluto, and, there's other things going on. But Joseph Stalin understood well that morality, what, we define as right and wrong, acceptable and unacceptable, could be shaped and molded quite easily, not only within himself, but with enough force applied to an entire nation. Not just morality, but ideas of truth, of what is true. But I think you can actually identify best the kind of reality bending that Saturn and Pisces specializes in one of Joseph Stalin's most famous quotes ever. I'm sure you've heard of it. That the death of one man is a tragedy. The death of a million people is a statistic. Not, a million tragedies, but a statistic, a fact, shows an awareness of how the human psyche works. If we're not connecting to it on an individual emotional level, then it's just kind of a fact, or just kind of a thing that to a large degree will leave others to define for us. Sort of becomes devoid of meaning when death is reduced to a number. There's no story or experience behind it, or at least behind your interaction with it. So, Stalin knew how to manipulate perception. He was quite good at manipulating the emotions of not only individuals, but then the population of, at the time and today, one of the largest by population countries in the world. Now, to a large degree, he did this through terror, but he probably serves as the poster boy for future dictators who would basically build a sort of cult of personality around themselves. He basically crafted an internal version of reality in which everything that he said was true and everything he did was good and everything that he was represented an ideal to be emulated and deified. But he was able to externalize that reality and impose it and make it the reality of a nation of millions and millions of people. Stalin represents a version of Saturn in Pisces that highlights the malefic side of Saturn. It's bringing sort of the cold, harsh, utilitarian perspective to an ideology. He was very much a pragmatist and an opportunist. That when it served him, he adhered to whatever version of Marxism that people more powerful than him adhered to, or whichever version it served him to adhere to, whichever one served him gaining additional power. Which, if you look at his chart, Mars is in the superior trine, Mars in Scorpio, which is super powerful. Mars is sort of utilizing Saturn in Pisces to achieve Mars in Scorpio ends. But you'll actually see Mars and Saturn in Pisces in the originator of communism, Karl Marx, who, with Karl Marx, and really the idea of communism in its pure form was to create a structure, an organized society, an organized social unit, laws and rules and all the Saturn stuff, all the fixins, out of the idea of dissolving boundaries which, separated people by class, sort of, broke down hierarchies, breaking down a sort of pyramid structure in favor of one that disperses power and resources and economic capacity throughout the populace, doing the Pisces thing. This is maybe something to actually note about how Saturn in Pisces really works. Is that while you have ideas of a sort of less structured structure, a dream and ideal built around dissolving boundaries, of creating greater unity and oneness, a more beautiful and romanticized version of the world. It all stems from a fundamental awareness of the sort of facts on the ground, which are, that those walls exist. There are very hard and pervasive walls which separate us from each other economically, socially, intellectually, philosophically, spiritually, you name it. Not saying it's a good thing, but they do exist. Some of them exist for good reason, some of them don't. But it is sort of that harsh reality entering Pisces with Saturn entering Pisces. Saturn representing both the problem being highlighted and the potential solution. The solution to, lack of unity, Saturn and Pisces, is to build a new structure that facilitates greater unity and integration, Saturn and Pisces. But anyway, you get that with Karl Marx, with Stalin, with hippies, with romantics. You just get very, different versions, how that plays out, and, what is done with that information. To, go back to Stalin a little bit, because he's fun, right? He's a fun guy. One of the quotes that I quite like from him, that I think almost sounds like words straight out of Saturn and Pisces' mouth, is, quote, "Mankind is divided into rich and poor, into property owners and exploited, and to abstract oneself from this fundamental division and from the antagonism between poor and rich means abstracting oneself from fundamental facts." So it's interesting, right? It's, again, highlighting an awareness of what is real, but doing also in practice in his life a thing that Saturn will often do, which is create a false reality or perpetuate one or utilize one. It's one of the classic significations of Saturn that I always found really interesting, is that Saturn signifies the feigning of appearances, which, how can a planet describe what is real and hard and true, as well as what is false and fake at the same time? Well, knowledge of one often facilitates and necessitates knowledge of the other. And how you utilize that knowledge is another question entirely. But with Stalin, he in many ways showed one version of reality to his people, to his country, while maintaining a different one within himself. Or, is perfectly willing to perpetuate the ideological front and use it as a means to an end. Stalin, in many ways, created an ideological prison state in a lot of ways. And he, was pretty self-aware of what he was doing. He saw ideas as weapons. Not to get too, quote, happy with Joseph Stalin, but one of his famous quotes are, ideas are more powerful than guns. We would not let our enemies have guns. Why should we let them have ideas? He, applied this philosophy both to his enemies politically and internationally, but also to his people. Stalin understood that the reality construct that people live in is a powerful thing. It defines their reactions. It defines what they're willing to accept as true, what they're willing to do. And the more control he had over that, the more he could and did bend an entire nation to his will. And there's a lot of great Stalin quotes, actually. The writer is the engineer of the human soul. You got your Saturn Pisces there. The idea that you can engineer a human soul by, either controlling the ideas that get to them or delivering an idea in a specific way that conveys things in a way that pushes, steers, manipulates this sort of amorphous human thing that we've referred to as a soul, our very essence. Gratitude is a sickness suffered by dogs. I just think that one's funny. It's not Jupiter in Pisces, that's for sure. But Stalin was also a very paranoid guy, which you can see in several areas of his chart. But after the invasion of the Soviet Union by Germany, he basically had like a week-long nervous breakdown where he had convinced himself that him and Hitler were bros, and that they were gonna basically lethal weapon the world together. And it basically shattered his whole world when Hitler invaded. He totally panicked and freaked out, as did everybody else, and he went into seclusion for several days, if not a full week. I don't know the exact number of days. But he came out of it, and through extremely ruthless measures, through basically being more terrifying to his people than Hitler and his army were, he completely, you could imagine it as like harnessing the power of an ocean in a lot of ways, as Nazi forces were just steamrolling over the eastern part of the country where all the factories were. He's just like, yeah, we're going to just take all the factories with us and put them over here. And any people that I need, they go over here. And literally, one of the main strategies of the Russian army throughout World War II was just fucking human wave tactics, like just endless waves of human bodies. The fucking Saturn and Pisces goes deep with Joseph Stalin. It's but you can't really pull it apart from Mars in Scorpio. Anyway, point being that Stalin was a guy who was very self-aware of his internal reality and its weaknesses and fragilities. He was, aware of his paranoia to a large degree, and not that he wanted to change it necessarily, or was on a soul-searching journey to fix it by any means, but he was aware of the ability for the structure of his internal reality to snap, and how detrimental that was to not only his agenda, but, the country, which was him too. In his mind, it was an extension of him. Now, I know I've gone on a lot about Joseph Stalin and a lot of historical examples. It's probably going to be my longest video ever, I'm sure. But what I'm hoping is that what we've set up is some pretty clear-cut examples and some pretty strong impressions being pressed in, I guess, via these examples that will support and make sense of what we're talking about when we talk about how Saturn just plays out for people. What people are usually dealing with Saturn and Pisces. What is Saturn doing? What is it going to do to you if it's your Saturn return and you have Saturn and Pisces, which we will talk about now. But hopefully you're getting the idea of the sort of plane of reality that Saturn is working with. That sort of, it's not all of reality. It's just the part that integrates and makes meaning out of the rest of it. That's what Pisces does. Pisces takes all of lived experience, puts it in a soup, and tries to make a hearty healing meal out of that soup. Something that nourishes, sort of process and purify it into something that is fundamentally good and nourishing to the soul, or maybe even forms the basis for the existence of a soul. Anyway, Saturn and Pisces in your birth chart. What's going on with that? So one of the versions of Saturn and Pisces that people with Saturn and Pisces will often experience is having a sort of idealized version, or rather having an expectation of an ideal playing out in the area of Saturn, the area of life that Saturn and Pisces shows up in, and the experience of a sort of letdown in that area of life. There's usually a sort of dream cloud that the person has maybe high expectations around that initially at least doesn't quite get off the ground, like a balloon that's full of lead, right? Saturn and Pisces can be a bit of a dream crusher in some cases, especially early on in life. Obviously, this isn't always the case, but typically the success that is achieved either doesn't fit expectations or ends up coming with sort of bitter confrontations with the harsh realities of the thing. Or sometimes the actualized version of the dream sort of gets corrupted or feels like it gets tainted in some way, like some version of the ideal had to be sacrificed, which is usually followed by a period of disillusionment, which can range considerably in severity, depending on what Saturn is doing in the chart, right, and other conditions. When Saturn is in Aquarius, one of the themes that I've seen a lot is the Saturn in Aquarius part of the life will be sort of averse to solid definitions, especially like conventional ones. I've seen a lot of Saturn in Aquarius people with Saturn in the 7th, where the relationships are very ill-defined, unconventional, sort of non-committal earlier on in life until around the Saturn return. And people usually start to figure out how to create a sort of personalized structure and definition for that area, or for being in relationships that fits their particular needs. There's like a movement from ambiguity to more solid definition, while Saturn in Pisces tends to follow a reverse sort of pattern where you come in with a sort of romanticized kind of rigid definition of how things should be in that area that tends to move in the direction of like dissolution, where it's a lot of those structures, idealized structures, don't stand the reality test, which again can range from just general kind of disappointment, like, oh, I had this idealized notion, and, I guess it's just growing up, having to accept things as they are, to, more extreme versions of that. It's actually a strong historical theme with Saturn and Pisces. You get the French Revolution. There was this really radical movement to overthrow the monarchy and abolish the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, and there was initial success in the initial establishment of a republic, but they weren't quite able to get the formula right. And in subsequent years, the government had to reform multiple times, and ultimately it was just overthrown, or not overthrown, but like slowly became, corrupted, and in part due to the French Revolution being so threatening to the status quo, and all the monarchs of Europe, basically going to war with France almost by necessity in a certain way, or due to the lack of like a well-tested Republican-style democracy that contained the kind of structures, necessary to hold a country together under that kind of pressure, slipped into the hands of a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte, sort of turned into a military dictatorship and eventually an empire. You also had Saturn in Pisces during the post-Civil War Reconstruction era, or really at the end of it, in 1877. This sort of huge endeavor to reintegrate the former Confederate states in the South, politically, socially, economically, and rebuild it, just kind of fizzled out for a lot of reasons, and it ended up being kind of a botched job that resulted in close to another century of racial segregation in the South, as well as lasting poverty in the South that continues to this day. So, yeah. Finally, you do get, was it in 1906, Saturn was in Pisces, and a sort of a smaller precursor version of the Russian Revolution took place, which was basically like a peasant revolt against the Russian government. The Tsar, this very autocratic monarchy that, in practice still was essentially a feudal system. And the peasants led a pretty successful rebellion that caused enough trouble to get the Tsar to agree to set up a parliament, Russian parliament. And all that, for the time, satisfied the Russian peasants. The Duma, basically Russia's parliament that was formed, was just sort of this kind of performance theater of democracy. The Duma's power to enact legislation of any kind was nominal at best, and the Tsar pretty much maintained the same level of autocratic power that he had before. Similarly, the a lot of elements of the counterculture movement were similar, where there were a lot of radical ideas to usher in a new era of freedom and equality and fair treatment for all, that did not yield results that met expectations. Now, I know it paints a picture of Saturn and Pisces as like a lot of disappointment, and there definitely can be. But while in all these examples, the initial effort and attempts at imposing a new structure on things did not pan out in their original form, they did in many ways lay the groundwork for future reforms. The structures that were trying to be implemented were these sort of, we'll call it, high school essay version of, what was being attempted. A lot of great ideas, but maybe not quite ready for publication, And this is, part of what Saturn does in all signs, for the record. So don't feel like I'm beating up on you, Saturn and Pisces people. But part of the challenge of Saturn and Pisces really is the fallout of those initial disappointments, the like initial expenditure of enthusiasm, of idealism, and like Don Quixote, almost a sort of innocent and pure quality that Pisces can have initially. earlier in life. It can be rather like a big wave that could be really huge and really dramatic and seem unstoppable. But when it meets the hard surface of a cliff face, smashes against that wall and it just disperses. The tendency for the entire dream to just fall apart can yield like a sort of apathy that can, kind of spread and kind of seem to infect and contaminate the spirit. If somebody takes a dump in the middle of your living room floor, well, your room's going to smell bad, and you're going to have to bust out the carpet cleaner and, maybe a hazmat suit, and, you're going to have to clean it up. But, with a good rug doctor, some air fresheners, you open some windows. It's not the end of your living room. But if someone, say, takes a dump in your swimming pool.
Did you hear me? Don't touch it!
Everybody has to evacuate the pool at that point. Even after you've scooped the turd out of the pool, it's like you have to drain the entire thing at that point. The water's contaminated. So you'll sometimes get many versions of this in people's lives where there's almost like a backlash. Right after the Romantic movement sort of crusted and smashed against the cliff face of reality, realism appeared and became very prominent in the intellectual artistic sphere. That was both sort of a counterpoint to Romanticism, but also sort of a sort of extreme reaction to the disappointment and sort of defeatism in the face of sort of unstoppable machine of industrialization and capitalism. Likewise with hippies, right? You had the Summer of Love in 1969, and then you had Nixon and the huge, recession of the 1970s. And by the time you got to the 80s, most of the hippies had, turned in their billowy tie-dye shirts and hemp jewelry in exchange for suits with big shoulder pads and ties and desk jobs with 401ks. So all that is to say that, people at Saturn Pisces, you got to watch out for allowing, the initial obstacles and disappointments and harsh confrontations with the harsh realities of the world, getting the better of you and, allowing that to crush your dreams entirely. To a certain degree, experiences often need to be processed through that sort of total dissolution kind of internally most of the time, more so than in your, literally in your external life on a huge scale. But, just because somebody took a dump in your pool and you had to drain it, doesn't mean you need to abandon the pool. Drain the pool, refill the pool. Maybe be careful about who you invite to your pool next time, or, create a fence or a sign that says no pooping in the pool, right? Because while Saturn, does have that dream crushing power in Pisces, right? It also grants an ability to bring structure and definition to the, imaginal space, to, make solid and real the substance of dreams and imagination. In fact, you'll find Saturn in Pisces in the birth charts of a lot of prominent artists, specifically musicians who ended up being extremely influential within their particular genres, such as Buddy Holly, easily one of the most influential musicians in rock and roll. In many ways, he sort of served as the kind of founding father of rock and roll in a lot of ways. Trent Reznor with industrial music, right? Kurt Cobain, grunge, even Ariana Grande. In fact, both Buddy Holly, Trent Reznor, and Ariana Grande are all Capricorn risings too. So Saturn and Pisces is ruling their first house. But Ariana Grande's, while certainly the full breadth and depth of her influence on music is yet to be known. In fact, it should be interesting seeing how her career develops, given her Saturn return is about to start. I believe she is the second highest or second most downloaded musician currently. Uh, and it's interesting that you see Saturn in Pisces so prominent in the charts of musicians and artists in general. It's because at face value, Saturn is not obviously helpful, at least initially or directly helpful when it comes to facilitating an easy and natural connection to that sort of invisible space that we draw creative energy and inspiration from. But it's a theme that you'll see, with a lot of poets and stuff with Saturn and Pisces, is that it does seem to give an ability to tap into a common universal experience of, disconnection, of wanting to connect with the deeper meaning, right? Like particularly with Kurt Cobain and Trent Reznor, right? They're musicians who drew from a creative well of emotional experiences of disaffection, alienation, disillusionment, sort of grasping for the eternal and the universal, kind of reaching into the invisible and finding nothing, right? What does it mean? Is it all meaningless? It speaks to the sort of existential challenges that people with Saturn and Pisces will often deal with. It's like trying to connect with the divine, the spiritual, sort of praying to a wall, like a keen awareness of the difficulty in connecting with that deeper wellspring of joy and meaningful interface with the whole of existence. The sort of a despondency that can come from being unable to see the divine, if you will, reflected in lived reality. And I'd almost be hesitant to say that Saturn and Pisces creates an actual wall or barrier between that maybe divine connection that we're all sort of craving, but makes one acutely aware of where those boundaries are. As often people with Saturn and Pisces will have, challenging experiences around the topic of religion or spirituality in general. It's not always that, but a very common story where someone with Saturn and Pisces will grow up in a religious household, sometimes a very strict one that is potentially, dogmatic or revealed to the person or experienced by the person as clashing with their personal, lived experience. Like Ariana Grande, for example, who was raised Catholic, ended up leaving the church, because in part because of the Catholic Church's intolerant views towards homosexuality, and her brother is gay, so obviously that's a point where the personal sense of what is true or should be true, meaningful, and right clashes with the one presented, the structure that one had been brought up in, the spiritual religious structure. You'll see a lot of people with Saturn and Pisces, just experience religion or belief systems as being, very strict and oppressive and limiting. And there can be a lot of challenge around where to go from there, because they often, are aware of a deep need to believe in something. And in a lot of cases, you'll see like a interesting way where a lot of people with Saturn and Pisces will find their point of resolution in that area through almost agreeing to disagree. Like sometimes still identifying with the faith that they were brought up with, sort of recognizing that don't have to fully agree with that faith, or they can even openly challenge it and still identify with or be part of, that particular, religion. Which I think brings me to a relevant point that I think people with Saturn and Pisces will often struggle with, because Saturn adds weight and gravity to the emotional need to engage with the world in a meaningful way, in a way that feels connected to a deeper universal truth. Religion, serves that purpose for a lot of people. Um, while, in Sagittarius, right, the other Jupiter ruled sign, there is more of a bent towards a sort of black and white approach to religious topics, like searching for the orthodox version, the one true faith. Pisces, any planet in Pisces, will tend to relate to religion and spirituality and from a place of acknowledgement of the sort of grayness of truth, the sort of soup that our little notions that we cling to swim in, which all contribute and point to a deeper universal truth, but they're not, hard, solid things. They're squishy, watery things. They tend to veer more towards mysticism or animism or more non-doctrinal belief systems. Because the nature of Pisces is to want to accept and redeem, all of reality, all of the different viewpoints, to accept, each one as internally valid or, if not valid, understand, where that person is coming from and why, so that, they can forgive them, right? Because it's Pisces. It wants to let go. It wants to create a sense of unity through accepting that, while we all may move in different directions, we're all we're all swimming in the same pool. We're all coming from a place that feels true to us. But with Saturn in Pisces and Saturn sort of drawing the topics of Pisces to a hard, solid surface, there's a sort of understanding of how fragile and amorphous all our little independent notions of truth are. They're sort of flowing and changing and adapting and evolving. But from Saturn's perspective, it's like, what the fuck is this? What is true here? How can I create truth? How can I know what is real when what is constantly shifting and responding to subtle interactions and symbolic meaning in every little, facet of reality and experience. In a lot of ways, you can see how Saturn would, maybe come to the conclusion that, well, if this is reality, then it's kind of bullshit and, maybe meaningless. Maybe there is no meaning. If I can so easily develop a notion of reality and have it shattered into, a million pieces, and so can everybody else, what is there to believe? What can I build out of this squishy fluid stuff that refuses to adhere to a single shape? It's a bit of a conundrum for Saturn and a existential conundrum for people with Saturn in Pisces. And you often get the healthy version that will tend to emerge over time is a almost kind of pragmatic belief system, which may be rooted in a organized religion or spiritual practice here or there, because there's a recognition that at the end of the day we have to believe in something. We need a handrail to hold on to as we walk through life. And it can sometimes be a little bit like, one is as good as another, which is a bit of a more extreme manifestation of that. But the healthy version is a sort of acceptance and respect for that boundary that exists between the reality we live in and the, divine spiritual sphere, which lies beyond the veil, right? There's an acceptance of the mystery. And people with Saturn and Pisces will often have a sort of like a funny, sort of light-hearted, kind of pessimistic, sort of dark humor, like a recognition of the sort of place we find ourselves in, disconnected from, the truth of infinity. And there's no promise that there is anything divine lying beyond the veil, which might render our existence meaningful or, redeem it in some way. But, it's kind of a funny predicament to find yourself in, right? And sometimes there's, there's a potential to embrace the sort of power that gives you. If your belief system can be shaken to the core and destroyed entirely, it can just as easily be built again. And since it doesn't look like any divine beings are going to come in with any omniscient revelations, I may as well build a belief system that serves me, that works well for my purposes. But that's also where some of the danger lies with Saturn and Pisces, especially if, like the need for some belief system or worldview that feeds, some wounded part of the person in an unbalanced way is too strong. You can get a potential to construct a version of reality that can become, dangerously disconnected from the one that we all agree on, or at least the sort of root parts of it that we tend to agree on. Like, that human beings can't physically fly. We don't have wings. Any number of delusions could be fed and man, I can't say that word. Concretized with Saturn and Pisces that can easily spill out into the realm of insanity. Quite frankly, it's the build your own version of reality game is a dangerous one to play. It is in fact one that we're all playing to a certain degree, but most of us do try to construct it, at least in part, out of a sort of shared collection of bricks. It may well be that the Lego basket that we're all sharing is just a form of insanity that we all happen to agree on, but it's not necessarily a game that you want to play alone. If you're the only kid in the classroom using Kinects, everybody else is using Legos, you're off in the corner by yourself doing, other shit that, could potentially alienate you from the Lego kids. Granted, if you're really awesome at Kinects, you could build like a cool fucking robot, and some of the other kids will go, cool, I want to play with Kinects now too. And then suddenly you have a little group playing Kinects, which can certainly feed and bolster your little Kinects world that you're building. Nonetheless, this maybe speaks to the central theme that anybody with Saturn and Pisces will have to wrestle with to one degree or another. It's that the nature of the Piscean angle on life, the sphere of experience that it points to, demands a certain kind of Zen-like flow, sort of syncing with the natural rising up and passing away of experiences, and a willingness to engage with it meaningfully without trying to attach to it too rigidly. That, material is not the kind that Saturn is naturally well practiced in working with. Obviously it can, and it does. Saturn in Pisces has the ability to be the sort of anvil upon which you pound moments and experiences which naturally pass in and out of awareness. They're in the future, they're now, they're in the past. Saturn can pound those moments into something real, into something that it can share, into, works of art, works of spiritual and material value. It can use that power to heal and to capture, experiences that we want to endure beyond their sort of momentary existence. There always has to be a willingness to accept whatever seemingly permanent effigy you manage to pound into physical form or into communicable idea, that it is not going to be quite the real thing. That one night where you had your first kiss while walking on the beach under the fading light of a sunset. That moment in time is yours to cherish, was yours to experience, and it continues to be yours to share and communicate in any way possible, but you have to be willing to let it pass as well. To some degree, the perfectionism that many people with Saturn and Pisces have when it comes to doing art and stuff is what makes them great. But, any works of art, are obviously not all people with Saturn and Pisces are artists, right? But there's a sort of need to accept the impossibility of recreating a moment or ideal into an exact replica of the experience you're either seeking to recreate or that you imagined and want to see realized. Saturn also has certain necessary functions, one of which being knowing when to stop. And that can be a bit of a challenge, with Saturn and Pisces in different areas. But it's also in, creating healthy boundaries, in interpersonal relationships, in your relationship to anything outside of yourself and within yourself. It can be a general challenge. Saturn and Pisces is because you're trying to do it with stuff that, isn't really meant to be built into walls. I think one thing that seems to be a prevalent theme with Saturn and Pisces, maybe one of the biggest challenges, is the ability to forgive others for not measuring up to, what can be very reasonable expectations, and the ability to forgive yourself for not measuring up to your own or someone else's expectations, reasonable or otherwise. Saturn tends to bear down and hold on to whatever it's dealing with. And if it's a grudge or a wound of some kind, a vision of what should have or could have been that never was, it's, kind of important to grieve and give those feelings the attention they deserve, but at some point they have to be let go. And, if I could give homework to everyone for the time that Saturn is in Pisces, maybe, is to, examine yourself for any grievance that you hold against yourself or other people, or, another person, or to God. Find the biggest one if there's more than one, and make a project over the next 2.5 years or so, finding a way to dissolve that particular brick in your personal construct of reality, because it is almost definitely not helping you, and it will, feel a lot better. You may find that the space in the wall that's left in its place, may be a place through which something new and better can come through. This is a little more Sunday special than I usually prefer, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot. And Saturn is a good tool to apply to something like that, because it's not easy to let go of ingrained things like that. Sometimes it takes slowly grinding away at it, making a practice out of it that you engage a little bit with every day for a period of, say, 2.5 years with the power of Saturn. Sometimes that's what it takes. So I think I'm going to call it a wrap for today. I could never stop talking if I didn't draw the line somewhere. And I think typically with, planet and sign videos, I'm going to do a walk through the planet in each of the 3 decans of that sign. But I think in this case with Saturn, I'm going to do that in a separate video, because God knows how long this actually is at this point. So if you enjoyed this, found it useful, found it helpful, informative, please hit the little like button. Don't forget, it really helps. Subscribe. Share with people you think it might be helpful too. And if you really liked it and you want to see me become an even more amazing astrologer than I already am, I, for several years now, have been trying to go to Norwalk, but every time it comes up, it also comes up with a series of different unexpected bills. So I would really hate to miss out on it again this year. So if you are willing and able to helping me hammer that particular dream into reality, take a look at the notes and you will find a link to my Ko-Fi page, where I currently have a goal posted, which will potentially make it possible for me to attend Norwalk this year. So if you want to help make that happen, I would deeply appreciate it. You can book a reading with me through my website, KylePierceAstrologer.com. And if you're interested in learning about the decans or chatting about tarot with cool people, you will also find a link to the 3 of Wands Discord server. We'd love to have you. With that, I'm going to call it a day. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.